When I came over here, I was, I was in my mid-20s.
Right.
The first time I really came over here. You know, I had a whole bunch of weird paranoid suspicions about what the hell was going on because there was a lot of stuff I couldn't understand.
Mel Gibson is one of the most genuinely divisive figures in the entire history of Hollywood, and here's the honest, complicated truth about why. His downfall was never really about feuding with other actors. There's no long list of co-stars he brawled with, no string of bitter on-set rivalries in the mold of the classic Hollywood grudge. To understand how far he fell, you first have to remember just how high he'd climbed. This was a man who became a global superstar as the leather-clad anti-hero of Mad Max, who charmed audiences for a decade as the unhinged but lovable Martin Riggs in the Lethal Weapon films, who was crowned the very first sexiest man alive, and who then stepped behind the camera and directed Braveheart, walking away with the Academy Awards for Best Picture and Best Director. He had built a reputation not just as a handsome action lead, but as a serious, ambitious artist, a devout family man with a wholesome public image, the kind of bankable, all-American seeming icon studios could build a decade around. By the mid-90s, he was as bankable, beloved, and powerful as anyone in the business, a rare star who was equally trusted as an actor, a director, and a producer. And yet the forces that nearly destroyed all of it came almost entirely from within, a series of self-inflicted wounds rooted in his own words and his own conduct, captured on tape and in leaked documents, that turned an Oscar-winning megastar into an industry pariah. This is not a story about petty jealousy between leading men. It's the far more uncomfortable story of how a man at the absolute peak of his powers spent the better part of 2 decades dismantling his own reputation and the deep, still unresolved argument it sparked in Hollywood about talent, bigotry, accountability, and whether some lines, once crossed, can ever truly be uncrossed. So let's walk through the 6 controversies that cost Mel Gibson the career he'd built, in roughly the order they unfolded, and the picture they paint together. It begins for most people in 2004 with The Passion of the Christ. On paper, it was meant to be the crowning triumph of his career as a filmmaker. He financed the brutally graphic depiction of the final hours of Jesus largely with tens of millions of dollars of his own money after the major studios refused to touch a violent, subtitled film spoken entirely in ancient languages, and it became a stunning commercial phenomenon, grossing well over $500 million worldwide and turning into one of the most profitable independent films ever made. After the major studios passed, the film was ultimately released through a smaller distributor, opening on Ash Wednesday and drawing enormous crowds organized by churches across the country, a genuine cultural event that no one in the industry had seen coming. But the film arrived buried in controversy. Even before its release, Jewish organizations including the Anti-Defamation League, along with a number of prominent rabbis and scholars, raised serious alarms after reviewing an early version of the script, warning that the film's portrayal risked reviving one of the oldest and most dangerous anti-Semitic tropes, the idea that the Jewish people as a whole bore collective guilt for the death of Christ. They feared openly that it could fuel real-world anti-Semitism and drag religious attitudes backward. Gibson and his defenders insisted the film was simply faithful to the gospel accounts and was not an attack on anyone. The debate was ferocious and was never fully resolved, with the film finding passionate champions among millions of devout Christian viewers, even as it deepened suspicion elsewhere. It certainly didn't help that Gibson's own father had, in the same period, given interviews minimizing the scale of the Holocaust, comments that drew enormous attention and inevitably raised hard questions about what views the son might privately hold. The Passion made Gibson a hero to a vast religious audience and a figure of deep distrust to many others, and it put a target on his back that the very next controversy would turn into a direct and devastating hit. In hindsight, it marked the precise moment the 2 competing versions of Mel Gibson, the gifted, sincere artist, and the man harboring something uglier, became impossible to separate in the public mind. That hit came in July of 2006, and it remains the single most defining scandal of his life. Gibson was pulled over and arrested for drunk driving on the Pacific Coast Highway near Malibu, and what might have been a routine, if embarrassing, celebrity DUI became something far worse when the arresting deputy's report leaked to the press. According to that report, Gibson, heavily intoxicated, launched into an anti-Semitic tirade, blaming Jewish people for the wars of the world and directing slurs at the officers, alongside crude sexist remarks aimed at a female deputy. The fallout was immediate and severe. This was no longer a debate about how to interpret a film. These were reportedly his own words, in his own mouth, recorded in an official police document. Gibson moved quickly to contain it, issuing a lengthy public apology in which he called his statements despicable, blamed his lifelong struggle with alcoholism, admitted to battling his demons, and asked specifically to sit down with leaders of the Jewish community to begin some kind of healing. He followed it with a second, more detailed statement directed at that community, and over the following months he did meet privately with a number of Jewish leaders in an effort to make amends. Some accepted the apology as the genuine remorse of an addict at his lowest. Many others saw a man who was sorry only because he'd been caught and who had revealed in an unguarded moment what he truly believed. For the first time, a genuine A-list superstar found himself being quietly frozen out, his once untouchable bankability suddenly an open question. The timing was brutal too, landing just months before he was set to release his ambitious passion project Apocalypto. The 2006 ramp became the permanent lens through which everything else about him would be viewed, the moment a beloved movie star revealed something a large part of the public would never be able to unsee. If 2006 cracked his reputation, what happened in 2010 shattered it. And this is the chapter that took the story out of the realm of mere public relations crisis and into something genuinely disturbing. During an increasingly bitter custody battle with his former girlfriend, the Russian musician Oksana Grigorieva, the mother of his infant daughter, a series of recorded private phone calls were leaked online, first surfacing on a celebrity gossip site and spread across the internet like wildfire. On the tapes, Gibson was heard delivering a stream of racist, sexist, and threatening tirades, including explicit violent threats and a racial slur, in rants that horrified even people who had been willing to extend him the benefit of the doubt after 2006. The custody fight that produced him was as bitter as they come, with Gibson at one point accusing Grigorieva of trying to extort him, an allegation investigators ultimately could not substantiate, clearing her. There was no leaked report ambiguity this time, and no claim of a one-off drunken aberration. It was unmistakably Gibson's own recorded voice, sober, in a private setting. The legal aftermath was serious. He was charged in connection with the January 2010 incident, and in March of 2011, he pleaded no contest to a single count of misdemeanor battery against Grigorieva. He avoided jail but was sentenced to 3 years of probation, ordered to complete 52 weeks of domestic violence counseling and community service, hit with a small fine, and formally barred from using violence against anyone. The plea, even without admitting full guilt, made him one of the very few major modern stars to carry a domestic violence conviction on his record at all. In a sworn declaration filed in the custody case, he admitted to having struck her on one occasion. Gibson would later insist he entered the no-contest plea simply to bring the ordeal to an end for the sake of his children, rather than dragging everyone through a long public trial he believed he could have won, and he maintained his innocence even as he accepted the plea. The conviction was eventually expunged in 2014, after he completed every term of his sentence. But however one weighs his explanations, the tapes did damage that no apology or legal resolution could ever undo. They didn't merely suggest prejudice. To the public, they seemed to reveal a capacity for rage and cruelty that made Gibson, for a period of years, almost radioactive in the very industry he had once ruled. The Fork controversy showed that the pattern hadn't ended, and it played out publicly in 2012 through one of the strangest feuds in modern Hollywood. This one not with an actor at all, but with a famous screenwriter, Joe Esterhaas, the writer behind blockbusters like Basic Instinct and Flashdance. The two had teamed up on an ambitious Gibson passion project, a sweeping historical epic about Judah Maccabee and the Jewish rebels at the heart of the Hanukkah story, a film Gibson reportedly pitched grandly as a kind of Jewish Braveheart, with Warner Brothers attached. To many observers, the very idea of Gibson, of all people, making a heroic film celebrating Jewish history seemed like either a sincere bid at redemption or a calculated attempt to launder his battered image, and at least one prominent rabbi publicly argued the studio should be ashamed to be in business with him on such a project. When the studio rejected Esterhaas' draft and the film collapsed, Esterhaas fired off a blistering 9-page letter that promptly leaked to the press. The two had reportedly spent time together developing the project at Gibson's Costa Rican estate, and it was there, Esterhaas claimed, that he came to believe the whole endeavor was never sincere. In the letter, he alleged that throughout their time working together, Gibson had repeatedly made vile anti-Semitic remarks, had expressed open contempt for the project's Jewish subject matter, had dismissed the Holocaust, and had even confided that his real goal was to convert Jews to Christianity. Esterhaas claimed he had witnesses and even audio recordings to back it up. Gibson responded with a furious letter of his own, flatly denying the overwhelming majority of the accusations as utter fabrications, threatening legal action over the threatened tapes, and arguing that Esterhaas had only manufactured these complaints after his own substandard script was rejected by the studio. The truth between the two dueling accounts has never been definitively settled, and it remains a bitterly contested dispute. But the very public, very ugly nature of the fight only hardened the perception that Gibson simply could not outrun the same accusations, no matter what project he attached himself to. The fifth controversy is really an accusation that resurfaced and gathered new force over time, and it involves the closest thing to a fellow performer on this entire list, the actress Winona Ryder. Ryder, who is Jewish, first recounted the story in a magazine profile around 2010 and then repeated it in fuller detail a decade later. By her account, at a crowded party back in the 1990s, Gibson, while smoking a cigar, first made a crude homophobic comment to her gay friend, joking about whether he might catch AIDS, and then, when the subject of Jewish people came up in conversation, directed an anti-Semitic slur at her, questioning whether she was Jewish in grossly offensive terms. Gibson's representatives have firmly and repeatedly denied the account, calling it 100% untrue and accusing Ryder of fabricating the entire story, both when she first told it and when she revived it years later. Ryder, for her part, has stood by her recollection without wavering, stating that she remembers the encounter perfectly clearly and adding pointedly that while she believes deeply in redemption and forgiveness and hopes Gibson has found a healthy way to deal with his demons, she herself is not one of the people able to offer him that forgiveness. It needs to be said plainly that this remains a disputed allegation, his firm denial set against her detailed account, and listeners should weigh it as exactly that. But arriving on top of everything else, and uncomfortably echoed by similar claims from Eshta Haas, it carried real and tangible consequences. The fact that an anecdote from a party in the 1990s could, decades later, still cost Gibson a role speaks volumes about how completely the trust had eroded. When Ryder's account recirculated widely in 2020, Gibson was quietly dropped from an upcoming animated film he'd been attached to, a clear sign that the industry's deep wariness toward him was still very much alive, nearly 15 years after the first scandal had broken. Which brings us to the sixth and final force at work in this story, the one that ties the entire saga together, the long, grinding semi-blacklisting by Hollywood itself, and the unresolved war over whether Mel Gibson deserves a second chance. After 2006, and especially after the 2010 tapes, a large part of the industry simply stopped working with him. The leading man offers dried up, projects were quietly cancelled, and for years he was treated as a man whose obvious talent could no longer outweigh the weight of his baggage. And yet, crucially, the town never fully and unanimously closed ranks against him, which is precisely why this debate has never died down. A striking number of prominent figures publicly defended him over the years, with stars like Jodie Foster, who cast and directed him in her 2011 drama The Beaver during the worst of his exile, Robert Downey Jr., who very publicly called on Hollywood to find a way to forgive him, along with the likes of Gary Oldman and Whoopi Goldberg, all standing by him to varying degrees, often framing him as a deeply troubled and flawed man, wrestling with genuine deviance, rather than an irredeemable bigot, and pointing to his addiction, his apologies, and the years of relative quiet as evidence that people can change. His apologies and the years of relative quiet as evidence that people can change. Their willingness to vouch for him publicly, at real risk to their own reputations, kept a door cracked open that might otherwise have slammed shut for good. On the other side stood organizations like the Simon Wiesenthal Center, whose leaders argued forcefully that the pattern was simply too long, too consistent, and too well documented to be waved away as the mistakes of an addict, and who saw any quiet rehabilitation as a moral failure on the industry's part. Gibson himself then engineered a remarkable partial comeback in 2016 with Hacksaw Ridge, a wartime drama he directed that earned strong reviews and 6 Academy Award nominations, including a Best Director nod for Gibson himself, ultimately winning 2 of them, and proving that his filmmaking gifts, at the very least, remained fully intact. He has continued to work steadily ever since, both in front of and behind the camera, popping up in studio comedies, low-budget thrillers, and action films, directing again, and developing high-profile projects including a long-gestating sequel to The Passion. He has even, in recent years, been embraced in certain political circles and handed symbolic Hollywood ambassador roles, a reminder that his cultural standing now splits sharply along the same lines that divide the country itself. But he has never fully returned to the universal acclaim and 4-quadrant stardom he once commanded, and the central, agonizing question still hangs over him, entirely unanswered. Can extraordinary talent and the simple passage of time ever truly outweigh a record like his? Hollywood, to this day, has never been able to agree on the answer. So what's the real takeaway from all of this? If you came looking for a list of fellow actors Mel Gibson hated, the honest reality is that this was never that kind of story, and pretending otherwise would miss the entire point of it. Gibson's great conflicts were never with rivals competing for the same parts, or co-stars clashing over billing and screen time. They were with the consequences of his own words and his own actions, words captured in a police report, unleaked private recordings, and in a furious screenwriter's letter, and in an account from an actress that he has never quite been able to shake. The people most associated with his downfall, figures like Winona Ryder and Joe Esterhaz, weren't enemies locked in some petty showbiz feud. They were people who stated publicly that they had witnessed his prejudice firsthand, claims that he has consistently and forcefully denied. And the single largest force ever arrayed against him wasn't any one individual at all, but an entire industry and a watching public struggling collectively with a genuinely hard question about exactly where the limits of forgiveness ought to lie. That is what makes Mel Gibson such a uniquely uncomfortable figure to talk about. There's a real and sobering lesson in his story, and it has nothing to do with the usual Hollywood feud formula. We often assume that careers are made or broken by external forces, by rivals, by bad luck, by the whims of studios and critics. Gibson's collapse came from none of those things. It came from the inside, again and again, in a way no enemy could have engineered, no matter how determined. He is, by any honest measure, an immensely gifted actor and a genuinely brilliant filmmaker. The man behind Braveheart, The Passion of the Christ, and Hacksaw Ridge. And he is also a man whose own recorded conduct did more lasting damage to his name and his career than any rival in Hollywood could ever have dreamed of inflicting. The talent was never the problem. The man's own worst impulses were. In the end, the most formidable adversary Mel Gibson ever truly faced wasn't another star at all. It was himself.